perspectives. It is extremely important to me that the United States remain a place that is not only not hostile to heterodox thinking, but leads the world in heterodox thinking. This is our comparative advantage against places like China and Russia, which use fear to intimidate their people. If we cannot have heterodox thinkers operating with a feeling of safety in our own country, I believe that we are lost. What I'm going to say about Jeffrey Epstein is that if the official story isn't true, and that in fact he was an intelligence community construct, either US or foreign, then he was a very poor intelligence construct. I had someone potentially reach out to me and intimidate me a bit. I don't know if it was directed, but they seemed to know a great deal about me, and they were trying to, I thought, dissuade me from talking about this and investigating this. My feeling about this is as if I'm tripping over your construct, then you goofed. It's not my problem. Here's what went into my meeting of Jeffrey Epstein. My recollection is that Jeffrey Epstein had a staff of young adult women who I would guess were in their late 20s, perhaps early 30s. They seemed very professional. They seemed very attractive, and that they seemed to take his schedule and all of the sort of incidental executive function duties off of his hands. Principally, I dealt with them, according to my recollection, and not with Jeffrey directly. I believe I became aware that Jeffrey wanted to see me. And since I was at that time involved in a small hedge fund, I went to see him on 71st Street across from the Frick Museum. When I got to the door, it was an extraordinary experience. He, in fact, was living in what was, for Manhattan, which is famous for relatively small dwellings, even for the very rich, in a very large townhouse. I went through the door, I was greeted, was treated professionally, and I was led to a waiting room. In that waiting room, which I believe was off to the left as you entered, I sat in the chair for a while, and I noticed that there was a large mechanical piece of art. And I believe that it had some electronics to it. After a while of sitting in my chair, my recollection is that I went up to this art object and I started trying to inspect it. As I was looking at the art object, which I thought was quite innocent, I suddenly thought that I saw something like a lipstick camera. That is a very small camera whose lens was staring straight at me. My first thought was, holy cow, I've discovered that there's a hidden camera that has been trained on me while I've been in this room. I thought myself to be rather clever for having found it. But my second thought was exactly the reverse of this. I bet this isn't that difficult to find. The object that it was buried in attracts attention, and it must be that people who look at this object invariably find the camera. And then I started asking myself, am I supposed to find the camera? Is this a test? Is this person trying to make sure I'm comfortable with being under surveillance? The whole thing was now quite queer, and I went back and I sat down as I recall it. Shortly thereafter, almost responsive to finding the camera, my recollection is that I was called out of this room and I was led to the back where I was to wait for Jeffrey Epstein in a very large room with an enormous dining table. Now, what was most memorable about this dining table was that it had a tablecloth that I thought to be incredibly inappropriate. What I recall is that it had the appearance of a draped coffin, because the tablecloth was an extremely large American flag. If I recall correctly, there was another gentleman, perhaps another hedge fund person or a science person, who sat to my left. And I stared at this tablecloth and I thought, oh, you're going to serve me food on a tablecloth made out of the flag of my country? Is this a test of some kind of my loyalty to my country, or whether I have some sort of morality that isn't burdened by some petty reverence to an inanimate object? I couldn't tell what was going on, but I started getting extremely agitated and, in fact, angry. My recollection is that Jeffrey entered from the right with a young woman. In my mind, I remember her as being perhaps 22, 23. She was extremely attractive. As I recall, Jeffrey sat down and began bouncing this woman on his knee. So he motioned for her to sit down, and she appeared to be quite happy in this role as Jeffrey asked questions and discussed science, theories I had about markets, how they related to gauge theory, theoretical physics. I don't remember the man saying much to me, who was also in the room at the time. And so all I have a recollection of is the four of us: Jeffrey, the woman on his leg, and the other gentleman and myself. My recollection is also that in order to test our willpower and concentration, that Jeffrey would bounce this woman occasionally, that she would giggle in order to test our resolve as to whether we could stay focused in the conversation. I found him to be quite intelligent, but I also found that every single interaction with him resulted in my being back-footed conversationally. He was constantly trying to throw me off guard. And at some level, I was also irritated and angered. I was trying to keep my cool during this entire interaction. And I thought to myself, I don't know anybody who behaves this way. I knew several rich people at that point in my life, and I've known many more very wealthy people, perhaps billionaires of 10 and 11 figure fortunes. To the best of my recollection, I've never met a single other person who behaved in such a strange way. He didn't appear to be really that focused on markets and trading, and he appeared instead to be focused in creating a kind of cartoonish notion of what a billionaire might be in a very poorly drawn James Bond or Marvel comic movie. And in so doing, I came to start to believe that I was not really talking to somebody who was a hedge fund manager or a financier, but that I was instead talking to a very intelligent and extremely charismatic man. The meeting ended abruptly at some point, and I walked out. I remember feeling that there are very few times in your life when you feel the hair on the back of your neck rise up. I don't know whether that's literally what happened, but it was certainly the sense that I had met something unholy. And I remember calling my wife, and I remember talking to her, and I've used the word construct ever since. Jeffrey Epstein becomes entangled with Florida law enforcement for requesting or arranging massages from underage women that was almost certainly massage was a euphemism for some form of child prostitution. This was an extremely disturbing episode in which he was vigorously defended by a high-profile team, which is his right in an adversarial system. But it was with a particular vigor that I found absolutely disturbing and unsettling. And that the sentence given to Jeffrey Epstein seemed to be so reduced compared to what he was being accused of that I felt like I had to just check all of my intuitions. Why was such a light sentence being imposed? Further, people I knew went and visited him in prison and talked about him being a friend, talked about him being a massage enthusiast. It made no sense to me that this person who was being accused of some form of pedophilia was being treated very differently than I would have imagined by people that I very much respected at the time. But I have had another issue that I've tried to talk to people about, which I also think figures into this story. Why was Jeffrey Epstein so focused on science? And in particular, why was he focused on heterodox science? In my theory, what I fear and what I believe is that the American scientific project has not understood that it has been abandoning its scientific assets. And if you look at my work, you can notice that this is a through line having nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. In effect, we have made it impossible for American scientists to profit using the market from their discoveries because we exclude fundamental discoveries from intellectual property protection. Therefore, you have a problem that when you make a discovery, it is both inexcludable if you share it in the scientific literature and inexhaustible. That is, that anyone who discovers it can use it without precluding anyone else from using it. Okay, when you have something that fits those twin criterion, then even free market economists will agree that it constitutes a public good, a failure of the market to keep value and price in lockstep. In essence, we pay for scientific research out of taxpayer dollars because the market cannot price it correctly. So you have something which I believe to be of fantastic value, including military value and potentially industrial value as it is translated from pure science into technology. However, for some reason, the United States has been losing its appetite for funding high-level scientific research and protecting it with academic freedom as the university system goes into free fall. That is, our university system is structured as a Ponzi scheme. And after Vannevar Bush and the Endless Frontier Doctrine forced us to do our blue sky research inside of universities rather than inside of research institutions dedicated to the purpose, we developed a weird problem. We would no longer be able to pay our scientists and use the fact that people could contribute the labor of their youth into a system where they would then become professors to train other professors. If each professor trained perhaps 20 graduate students to become professors, you can tell that after a very short period of time, you've got a pyramid scheme that can't keep expanding as we did in the post-war system, where we educated sub 10% of our population at a post-secondary level, to around 1970 or so when we were educating around 50% of our population at a post-secondary level. So when the music stopped, the system started to decay. You had an extremely valuable system. I've said before that theoretical physics largely constructed our modern economy. It invented the World Wide Web. It invented the semiconductor. It gave us nuclear power, nuclear weapons, our communications technology, and the electromagnetic spectrum. So many of the things that we take for granted, including molecular biology, came out of theoretical physics. And so what I have likened this to is that the United States had something like a Ferrari convertible, and it left the top down so that it started getting filled up with rain, and it started scrawling "Steal Me" in Mandarin, Farsi, Russian on its front bonnet. We are not protecting our scientific assets. In fact, when Jeffrey Epstein came back out of prison, I think if I recall correctly, I tweeted that Jeffrey Epstein was somebody who was funding what the American government refused to fund. And I recall, if I'm not being too self-kind, that I said, "Welcome back" with a period rather than an exclamation point, because I was extremely dismayed that we are fundamentally leaving this open. We left a niche for such a person to start exploiting us. If Jeffrey Epstein was able to find this niche, then I believe that other nations will be able to find it as well. So what happened inside of the scientific enterprise is that many scientists had some memory from inside of the system when professors would in fact have potentially second homes or even third homes, where they would be paid at a level that was commensurate with financiers or high-priced lawyers. That in essence, the children of academic families were growing up with the children of very well-to-do families because there wasn't such income and asset inequality in the United States. I believe that the need to pay the scientific community, particularly the top members of the scientific community, at a far higher level is not a question of taxpayer dollars. It's a question of, first of all, being fair to the community that created our economy. Those are not taxpayer dollars. They are scientific dollars, in my opinion. We can argue that at some other point. But it's also a question of national interest. That is, that it is completely irresponsible for us to pretend that the market for scientific research talent should be determined by your ability to teach undergraduates. We should probably decouple the teaching and research enterprises. We should probably get rid of the majority of our research enterprise, and we should take care of the people who are obeying power laws at a very high level for the national interest. It's not a question about overpaying them. It's a question of we are leaving a valuable asset unguarded. And I believe that Jeffrey Epstein was attempting, in part, to gain control of that asset. That's why people like George Church or Robert Trivers or Stephen Hawking or any one of a number of people like Lisa Randall were found on Jeffrey Epstein's island. By the way, I think it's very important to stop using the fun phrases pedophile island and Lolita Express when you have people who almost certainly are not part of any kind of orgiastic culture like Lisa Randall or Betsy Devine. It's ridiculous. In part, what we're doing is we're turning a salacious story into a very dangerous national emergency if, in fact, Jeffrey Epstein was up to something very different than the mainstream story would have you believe.